in the quiet of a late evening, as the world slows and the stars begin to peek through the velvet sky, let us journey back to a time when kingdoms clashed and the fate of nations hung in the balance. Picture a land of rolling fields and shadowed forests, where the air hums with the distant clang of steel and the whispers of ambition. This is the story of the 100 Years' War, a sprawling saga that stretched across generations, weaving a tapestry of valor, betrayal, and sacrifice. It was not a single war, but a series of brutal conflicts between England and France, sparked by a dispute over a throne and fueled by the dreams of kings, knights, and a young peasant girl whose faith would change history. Imagine the year 1337, when the winds of war began to stir. The English crown, under Edward III, laid claim to the French throne, igniting a struggle that would span over a century. Castles would fall, armies would march, and the fields of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt would become legends etched in blood and glory. Yet, amidst the chaos, a singular figure would rise, a maiden named Joan of Arc, guided by visions and an unshakable belief in her divine mission. Her story, entwined with this epic conflict, is one of courage that still echoes through time. This video will carry you through the sweeping tides of the 100 Years' War, from its fiery beginnings to its bittersweet end. We'll walk through medieval courts, stand on battlefields where longbows sang and swords clashed, and witness the rise and fall of heroes who shaped the destinies of England and France. So settle in, let the worries of today fade, and allow this tale to unfold like a dream, guiding you gently into the past. Whether you're here to drift into sleep or to lose yourself in history's embrace, this story is for you. Hello, my name is Sherry, and welcome to my channel. So let's begin. The year was 1337, and the air over Europe carried a restless hum, like the distant murmur of a storm gathering on the horizon. In the courts of England and France, ambition and pride stirred, setting the stage for a conflict that would span generations. The 100 Years' War, though it would last 116 years, began not with a clash of swords, but with a quiet, simmering dispute over a crown, a dispute that would ignite a fire to consume kingdoms. Picture the medieval world, a patchwork of feudal loyalties, where lords held sway over muddy villages, and knights in gleaming armor swore oaths to kings who dreamed of glory. The fields of France, golden under summer suns, stretched beneath castles that stood like silent sentinels, their stone walls whispering tales of power and betrayal. It was here, in this land of ancient rivalries, that the seeds of war were sown. At the heart of the conflict lay a question of succession, a tangled web of bloodlines that bound England and France closer than either cared to admit. The French king, Philip IV, had died in 1328, leaving no direct male heir. His daughter, Isabella, was the mother of Edward III, the young and fiery king of England. By the rules of primogeniture, Edward believed he had a rightful claim to the French throne through his mother. But France, bound by Salic law, forbade inheritance through the female line. Instead, the French nobles crowned Philip VI, a cousin from the House of Valois, a decision that sent ripples of discontent across the Channel. Edward, barely out of his teens, stood in his court at Westminster, his eyes fixed on maps of France, his heart burning with the conviction that he was the true king. The French, in their grand halls at Paris, scoffed at the notion, their pride as unyielding as the walls of their fortresses. Beyond the throne, deeper tensions simmered. England and France were not merely neighbors, but rivals woven together by trade, land, and history. The English held Gascony, a rich duchy in southwestern France, as a fief under French sovereignty. This arrangement chafed both sides. The English resented French oversight, while the French bristled at foreign control within their borders. In the wool markets of Flanders, another spark glowed. Flemish merchants, dependent on English wool, leaned toward Edward, defying their French overlords. Philip VI, determined to assert his authority, tightened his grip on these restless territories, confiscating Gascony in 1337 and declaring Edward a traitor to his feudal vows. It was a provocation too bold to ignore. Imagine Edward III standing tall in his council chamber, his dark eyes glinting with resolve. At 25, He was no longer the boy king of his early reign, but a man shaped by ambition and the weight of his lineage. His advisors, a mix of grizzled barons and sharp-eyed clerics, urged caution, but Edward's heart was set. He would not bow to Philip. In a bold proclamation, he declared himself the rightful king of France, quartering the French fleur-de-lis with the English lions on his royal arms. It was a gesture of defiance, a gauntlet thrown across the sea. The French court, draped in silks and lit by flickering torches, received the news with cold fury. Philip VI, a man of stern dignity, vowed to crush this upstart king and secure his throne. The world of 1337 was one of contrasts, where chivalry and brutality walked hand in hand. Knights swore oaths of honor, their armor polished to mirror the sun, yet war brought slaughter to fields where peasants toiled. The church, a towering presence, blessed both sides, its bishops praying for victory while urging peace. Villages huddled in the shadow of castles, their inhabitants caught between loyalty to their lords and the fear of armies trampling their crops. Across the Channel, English longbowmen, hardy men from the countryside, practiced their craft, unaware that their skill would soon reshape battlefields. In France, knights trained in the art of the charge, their war horses snorting in the morning mist, confident in their superiority. As Edward gathered his forces, the mood in England was one of cautious excitement. Merchants whispered of wealth to be gained, knights dreamed of glory, and mothers prayed for sons who would march to war. In France, Philip prepared his armies, summoning vassals from across his realm. The Loire and Seine rivers, winding through fertile lands, reflected the gathering clouds of conflict. Messengers rode through the night, carrying sealed parchments that spoke of alliances and betrayals. The world held its breath, sensing the weight of what was to come. Yet, as the two kings faced each other across the narrow sea, neither could foresee the century of struggle that awaited. The war they began would not be a single campaign, but a saga of triumphs and tragedies, of heroes rising and falling like stars in the night sky. The spark had been struck, and the flames of war were ready to rise. Would Edward's bold claim lead to victory, or would Philip's resolve hold France together? The answer lay in the battles to come, where blood would stain the fields and the fate of nations would be written. The year 1340 dawned over a Europe poised on the edge of chaos, its fields and seas trembling with the weight of ambition. The 100 Years' War, sparked by Edward III's audacious claim to the French throne, was no longer a matter of words and proclamations. It was a fire ready to blaze, and its first true flames would rise not on the rolling plains of France, but on the restless waves of the North Sea. Picture the port of Sluys, where the waters of the Zwin estuary lapped against wooden docks, and ships swayed like silent giants under a sky heavy with clouds. Here, on June 24, 1340, the war's first great clash unfolded, a naval battle that would send ripples through the courts of England and France, setting the tone for the decades to come. Edward III, now 28, stood on the deck of his flagship, the Cog Thomas, his cloak snapping in the salty breeze. His dark hair was tucked beneath a helmet, and his eyes scanned the horizon, where the French fleet loomed like a forest of masts. The English king had sailed with a purpose, leading a flotilla of some 200 ships, cogs, galleys, and smaller vessels packed with archers and men-at-arms. Across the water, Philip VI's fleet, bolstered by Genoese mercenaries and Castilian allies, numbered nearly as many, their ships chained together in a defensive line to block the estuary. The French, confident in their numbers and the strength of their crossbowmen, believed the sea would be their shield. But Edward, with the heart of a lion and the mind of a strategist, saw opportunity where others saw peril. The Battle of Sluys was no elegant dance of chivalry, but a brutal collision of wood, iron, and flesh. As the English ships closed in, the wind at their backs, their longbowmen took aim. Imagine the scene. Arrows hissing through the air like a swarm of deadly hornets, their iron tips piercing armor and splintering decks. The French, packed tightly on their chained vessels, had little room to maneuver. Their crossbows, slower to reload, could not match the relentless rain of English arrows. Edward, directing his fleet with a steady hand, ordered his ships to grapple the enemy, turning the battle into a chaotic melee. Sailors and knights clashed with swords and axes, the sea turning red beneath them. The cries of the wounded mingled with the creak of timbers and the roar of waves as ships burned and sank into the depths. By dusk, the estuary was a graveyard of broken hulls and drifting banners. The French fleet was shattered, with estimates of their losses reaching as high as 20,000 men, a staggering toll that left Philip VI reeling. Edward's victory was not just a triumph of arms but a bold statement. England could strike at France's heart, even on the sea. The morale of the English soared, their king hailed as a master of war. In the taverns of London and the halls of Westminster, men toasted Edward's name, their voices warm with pride. Across the Channel, the French court fell silent, the weight of defeat pressing heavily on Philip's crown. Yet even in victory, Edward knew this was but the first step. The sea was won, but the land of France still lay beyond his grasp. The years that followed saw England press their advantage, though not without struggle. Edward's campaigns in northern France were bold, but costly, his coffers drained by the weight of war. In 1341, the conflict spilled into Brittany, where rival claimants to the duchy drew both kings into a proxy war. The English backed John de Montfort, while the French supported Charles of Blois, turning Brittany's rugged hills into a battleground. Small skirmishes flared, with English archers and men-at-arms clashing against French knights in forests and along muddy riverbanks. The war was not yet the grand spectacle of later years, but each encounter honed the skills of Edward's army, particularly the longbowmen, whose deadly accuracy would soon become legend. Picture a Breton village at twilight, its thatched roofs glowing faintly under the setting sun. Peasants huddled in their homes, listening to the distant tramp of boots and the clink of armor. English soldiers, weary but resolute, camped in nearby fields, their fires casting shadows on the trees. Across the valley, French forces gathered, their banners fluttering in the evening breeze. These early campaigns were a testing ground, a chance for both sides to measure their strength. Edward's men learned to move swiftly, striking and retreating before the French could bring their full might to bear. Philip, stung by slies, grew cautious, his advisors urging him to fortify his northern borders. Yet the war was not without its pauses. Both kings faced the limits of their resources, gold, men, and the will of their nobles. Edward, ever ambitious, sought allies in the Low Countries, wooing Flemish merchants with promises of trade. Philip countered by strengthening his ties with Scotland, hoping to pin England between two fronts. The chessboard of Europe was shifting, each move calculated, each alliance fragile. In the quiet moments between battles, one could almost hear the land itself breathe, a land weary of war yet unable to escape its pull. As the 1340s unfolded, the early victories at Sluys and in Brittany gave England a foothold, but the path to France's throne remained steep. Edward's dream of ruling both kingdoms was alive, but the cost was mounting. In the flickering light of campfires, soldiers whispered of greater battles to come, of fields where glory and death walked hand in hand. The war was young, its story only beginning to take shape. Could England sustain this momentum, or would France find a way to turn the tide? The answer lay in the years ahead, where a single battle would redefine the art of war and etch its name into history's pages. The year 1346 cast a restless shadow over the fields of northern France, where the winds carried the scent of rain and the promise of battle. The 100 Years' War, now nearly a decade old, had simmered through skirmishes and sieges, but its true fury was about to break. Edward III, emboldened by his naval triumph at Sluys, had set his sights on the heart of France. Picture the rolling hills of Normandy, where apple orchards swayed under summer skies and villages nestled beneath the watchful gaze of stone churches. It was here that Edward landed with an army of some 14,000 men, knights, archers, and foot soldiers, their boots churning the earth as they marched inland. The French, under Philip VI, rallied to meet them, their banners snapping in the breeze, their hearts heavy with the need to defend their homeland. The stage was set for a clash that would echo through the ages, the Battle of Crécy. Imagine the morning of August 26, 1346, as dawn broke over the fields near Crécy-en-Ponthieu. The English army, weary from weeks of marching and plundering, took position on a gentle ridge. Edward, his armor glinting in the early light, stood among his men, his voice steady as he directed their formation. At the heart of his strategy were the longbowmen, rugged yeomen from England's countryside, their yew bows as tall as themselves, capable of loosing arrows with deadly precision. These were not the knights of chivalric tales, but men of grit and skill, their hands calloused from years of practice. Edward positioned them on the flanks, with dismounted knights and men-at-arms in the center, a wall of steel to anchor the line. Across the valley, the French army gathered, a host of perhaps 30,000, their numbers swelled by knights in gleaming plate armor and Genoese crossbowmen hired for their expertise. As the day wore on, clouds gathered, and a light rain began to fall, turning the ground to mud. The French, confident in their superior numbers, advanced in a glittering tide. Philip VI, astride his warhorse, believed his knights, nobles trained from boyhood in the art of the charge, would crush the English rabble. But Edward's longbowmen were a weapon unlike any the French had faced. As the Genoese crossbowmen trudged forward, their heavy weapons slowed by wet strings and muddy fields, the English archers let fly. Arrows arced through the air, a storm of feathered death that struck with terrifying force. Each archer could loose up to 10 arrows a minute, their iron-tipped shafts piercing armor and felling men before they could close the distance. The Genoese faltered, their ranks breaking under the onslaught, and in their retreat, they clashed with the advancing French knights, sowing chaos. The French cavalry, undeterred, charged up the slope, their hooves thundering against the earth. Imagine the scene, a wave of armored knights, lances lowered, their war cries rising above the din. But the longbows sang again, and arrows rained down, punching through shields and breastplates. Horses screamed, rearing in panic, as riders tumbled into the mud. The English line held firm, their knights and men-at-arms meeting the survivors with swords and axes. Among them stood Edward's 16-year-old son, the Black Prince, earning his spurs in the heat of battle. Hour after hour the French attacked, wave after wave, each charge met with the same relentless hail of arrows. By nightfall, the field was a slaughterhouse, littered with the bodies of French nobles. Perhaps as many as 10,000, including dukes, counts, and the flower of their chivalry. The English losses were light, a testament to their discipline and the longbow's devastating power. Crécy was more than a victory, it was a revelation. The longbow, wielded by common men, had humbled the pride of France's knightly class. In the flickering light of campfires, English soldiers shared tales of the day, their voices hushed with awe. Across the Channel, news of the triumph spread, bolstering Edward's reputation as a warrior king. But the war was far from over. Edward turned his eyes to Calais, a vital port on the French coast. The siege that followed was grueling, lasting nearly a year. Picture the walls of Calais, battered by English catapults, as its citizens endured starvation within. In August 1347, the city surrendered, its keys handed to Edward in a moment of grim triumph. Calais would remain an English stronghold for centuries, a foothold on French soil. Yet, even as Edward's banners flew over Calais, the cost of war weighed heavily. The fields of Crécy, once green, were stained with blood, and the cries of the fallen lingered in the air. France, reeling from defeat, faced a kingdom divided, nobles questioning Philip's leadership, peasants bearing the burden of taxes and raids. The victory at Crécy had shifted the war's momentum, but it also deepened its brutality. Both sides now knew the stakes. This was no mere feud, but a struggle that would test the endurance of nations. In the quiet of the night, as soldiers cleaned their weapons and priests prayed for the dead, a new shadow loomed, not of war, but of something darker, something that would halt the clash of armies and bring both England and France to their knees. What force could be so great as to pause this relentless conflict? The answer was creeping closer, carried on the winds of fate. In the wake of Crécy and the fall of Calais, the fields of France lay quiet, but it was not the peace of victory or truce that stilled the clash of swords. By 1348, a shadow far darker than war crept across Europe, its presence felt in the whispers of travelers and the dread in villagers' eyes. The 100 Years' War, with its banners and battles, paused as a new enemy emerged, one that cared not for crowns or claims, but struck kings and peasants alike. This was the Black Death, a plague that swept through the continent like a scythe, leaving death and despair in its wake. Picture a medieval world caught unawares, bustling markets falling silent, church bells tolling endlessly, and the air heavy with the scent of fear and decay. The war, for a moment, was forgotten, as England and France faced a foe they could not fight with steel. Imagine a small village along the Seine, its cottages huddled together under a gray autumn sky. In the summer of 1348, strange tales reached its people, stories of a sickness born in distant lands, carried on ships that docked in Sicily and Marseille. By autumn, the plague had reached France's shores, its tendrils spreading through crowded towns and muddy lanes. The Black Death, likely a form of bubonic plague, struck with terrifying speed. Victims burned with fever, their bodies marked by swollen, blackened lymph nodes, buboes that gave the plague its name. Death often came within days, sometimes hours, leaving families to mourn beside unburied bodies. In the ports of Normandy, where English soldiers still lingered, the disease spread among the ranks, indifferent to their recent triumphs. Across the Channel, England was no safer. The plague arrived in Dorset by August 1348, carried by sailors or fleas hiding in cargo. From there, it raced through villages and cities, sparing no one. London, a labyrinth of narrow streets and packed tenements, became a charnel house. Imagine the city's heart, its markets, once alive with the cries of vendors, now eerily quiet save for the creak of carts collecting the dead. Priests, overwhelmed, gave last rites in haste, while churchyards overflowed, forcing mass graves to be dug in open fields. Chroniclers of the time, their quills trembling, recorded losses that defy comprehension. Perhaps a third to half of Europe's population perished, with some regions losing even more. In France, entire villages stood empty, their fields untended, their hearths cold. The plague reshaped the world in ways no battle could. In the countryside, where peasants toiled to feed armies, the labor force dwindled, leaving crops to rot. Lords, desperate for workers, faced rebellion from survivors who demanded higher wages. In England, Edward III issued the Statute of Laborers in 1351, trying to freeze wages and bind peasants to their land, but the old feudal order was cracking. In France, the devastation was even starker. Philip VI, already weakened by Crécy, saw his authority falter as nobles and commoners alike questioned a king who could not protect them from this unseen scourge. The church, too, faltered, priests died in droves, and those who survived faced accusations of abandoning their flocks. Faith wavered, and whispers of divine punishment filled the air. Picture a lone survivor, a young woman in a French village, standing amidst abandoned homes. Her family gone, she walks past silent forges and empty barns, the weight of loss heavy on her shoulders. Yet in her heart, a flicker of resilience burns. Across Europe, such survivors rebuilt, their lives forever marked by the plague's shadow. The Black Death did not discriminate, but it reshaped society's uneven Hawkins. The English physician who described the plague's symptoms noted that it struck hardest in crowded towns, where men, women, and children perished together. The war's pause gave both nations time to mourn, but it also sowed seeds of unrest, as survivors demanded change in a world turned upside down. In the war's lull, the plague's impact lingered like a ghost. Armies depleted by disease struggled to regroup. Edward III, safe in his palace, planned his next move, but his coffers were strained and his men weary. In France, Philip VI's court was a place of grief and suspicion, as nobles plotted and peasants simmered with discontent. The plague had not ended the war, but it had changed its rhythm, forcing both sides to reckon with a world where death was no longer a distant threat, but a daily reality. By 1350, as the plague began to wane, the drums of war stirred once more. Armies gathered, and the clash of steel loomed anew. Yet the Black Death left scars deeper than any sword could cut. It was a reminder of mortality, a force that humbled kings and knights alike. In the quiet of a plague-ravaged village, one could almost hear the whispers of those lost, their stories woven into the earth. The war would resume, but it would do so in a world transformed, where the balance of power between kings and subjects, lords and laborers, was shifting. As England and France prepared to renew their struggle, a new battle loomed, one that would test not just their armies but the very fabric of their societies. What would this reborn war bring, and could either side reclaim the glory they once sought? The answer lay in the fields of Poitiers, where fate awaited with a trap of its own. As the Black Death receded, its shadow lingered over a Europe forever changed, but the embers of war refused to die. By 1355, the fields of France, though scarred by plague, stirred once more with the march of armies. The 100 Years' War, paused by the Great Pestilence, roared back to life, its hunger for glory undimmed. Edward III of England, his ambition as fierce as ever, turned his gaze to the heart of France, determined to press his claim to the throne. Across the Channel, France reeled under the weight of defeat and disease, yet its new king, John II, known as John the Good, burned with a resolve to restore his nation's honor. Picture the rolling vineyards of Aquitaine, their green slopes kissed by autumn light, now trampled under the boots of English soldiers. It was here, in 1356, that the war would deliver a blow so staggering it would shake the very foundations of France. The Battle of Poitiers. Edward's son, Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, led this campaign. At 26, he was a commander forged in the crucible of Crécy, his name already a whisper of fear among the French. With an army of some 6,000 men, longbowmen, knights, and Gascon allies, he swept through southern France, raiding and burning to draw the French into battle. Imagine the scene. Villages reduced to smoldering ruins, their church bells silent, as peasants fled into the hills. The Black Prince, clad in dark armor that gave him his name, rode at the head of his men, his eyes sharp with purpose. John II, newly crowned and eager to prove his mettle, mustered a force of perhaps 16,000, determined to crush this English incursion. The two armies met near Poitiers, in a landscape of hedgerows and gentle hills, on September 19, 1356. The battlefield was a patchwork of fields and vineyards, the morning air cool with the promise of fall. The English took a defensive position, their longbowmen stationed behind natural barriers, hedges and ditches that would break the momentum of a cavalry charge. The Black Prince, calm but resolute, knew his smaller force could not afford a prolonged fight. Across the field, John II's army glittered with the armor of France's nobility, their banners a riot of color under the sun. French knights, eager for glory, believed their numbers and chivalry would overwhelm the English, just as they had hoped at Crécy. But the longbow, that humble weapon of yew and sinew, waited to prove them wrong once more. As the battle began, the French advanced in waves, their heavy cavalry thundering forward. The English archers loosed their arrows, a storm of feathered shafts that tore through armor and sent horses crashing. The French knights, weighed down by plate armor, struggled in the muddy terrain, their charges faltering under the relentless hail. Hour after hour, the English held their ground, their discipline unshaken. The Black Prince, seeing the French lines waver, seized his moment. He ordered a daring counterattack, his mounted knights and Gascon allies charging into the fray, while archers continued their deadly work. The French ranks buckled, and chaos ensued. In the heart of the melee, a prize beyond measure fell into English hands. King John II himself was captured, surrounded by his guard and taken prisoner alongside his young son, Philip. The capture of a king was no mere victory. It was a thunderbolt that shook the medieval world. Imagine the scene as dusk settled over Poitiers, the battlefield strewn with the fallen, their armor glinting faintly in the fading light. English soldiers, exhausted but triumphant, guarded their royal captive, while French survivors fled into the night, their morale shattered. John II, a man of courage if not always wisdom, was treated with the respect due a king, but his capture was a humiliation France could scarcely bear. The English losses were light, perhaps 2,000, while the French suffered thousands dead, including many of their noblest lords. The Black Prince, now a legend, escorted his prisoner to Bordeaux, where John's fate would be decided. The aftermath of Poitiers led to the Treaty of Brétigny in 1360, a desperate bid for peace. France, leaderless and broken, agreed to harsh terms. Edward III gained vast territories, including Aquitaine and Calais, and a ransom of 3 million gold crowns was set for John's release, a sum that would beggar the French treasury. Imagine the French court, its halls once filled with music and laughter, now shadowed by defeat. Peasants, crushed by taxes to pay the ransom, whispered of rebellion, while nobles plotted to fill the power vacuum. In England, Edward celebrated, his dream of a dual monarchy seemingly within reach. Yet, peace was a fragile thing, and the treaty's promises would soon unravel. The victory at Poitiers was a high watermark for England, but it also sowed seeds of discord. France, humiliated, began to stir with a new resolve, as voices called for reform and resistance. The Black Prince, hailed as a hero, could not foresee the challenges that lay ahead, as his conquests stretched England's resources thin. In the quiet of a French village, a survivor of Poitiers might look to the stars, wondering if his nation could rise again. The war, far from over, was entering a new phase, one where cunning would matter as much as courage. What would become of France, stripped of its king, and could England hold its gains against a wounded but defiant foe? The answer lay in the years to come, where a new leader would emerge to challenge the tides of war. The year 1360 draped Europe in an uneasy calm, like the hush before a storm gathers strength. The Treaty of Bretagne, signed in the wake of Poitiers, had promised peace, but its ink was barely dry before cracks began to show. France, humbled by the capture of King John II and the cession of vast territories to England, lay wounded but not broken. The fields of Aquitaine, now under English control, bloomed with uneasy tension, while the French crown struggled under the weight of a ransom that drained its coffers. Picture a French village at dawn, its people weary from war and plague, yet stirring with a quiet resolve. The 100 Years' War, though paused, was far from over, and in this fragile interlude, the seeds of France's resurgence were sown, tended by a new king and a cunning warrior who would shift the tide. John II, still a captive in England, left France in the hands of his son, the Dauphin Charles, a young man thrust into a role he was not yet ready to bear. Crowned Charles V in 1364 after his father's death, he was no warrior king like Edward III, but a scholar with a sharp mind and a patient heart. Imagine him in the candlelit halls of Paris, poring over maps and letters, his brow furrowed as he navigated a kingdom fractured by defeat. France was a land of unrest. Peasants, crushed by taxes to pay John's ransom, rose in the Jacquerie, a bloody revolt that shook the nobility. Brigands, known as routiers, roamed the countryside, mercenaries left jobless by the truce, looting villages and defying royal authority. Charles V, dubbed the Wise, knew that brute force alone could not heal his realm. He needed a new strategy, one that would outwit the English rather than outfight them. Enter Bertrand du Guesclin, a Breton knight whose name would become a beacon of French hope. Picture a man of modest birth, stocky and weathered, his face carved by years of battle, yet his eyes alight with cunning. Du Guesclin was no polished noble, but a master of guerrilla warfare, a fox among the lions of chivalry. Charles V, recognizing his talent, made him constable of France, entrusting him with the task of reclaiming lost lands. Du Guesclin's approach was unlike the grand charges of Crécy or Poitiers. He favored ambushes, night raids, and swift strikes, targeting English garrisons and supply lines. Imagine a moonlit forest, where French soldiers, led by Du Guesclin, slip through the shadows, their blades glinting as they fall upon unsuspecting English outposts. His tactics wore down the enemy, avoiding pitched battles where the longbow could dominate. In Aquitaine, the Black Prince, now ruling as Prince of Aquitaine, faced growing resistance. His court at Bordeaux was splendid, filled with music and feasting, but the cost of his campaigns strained his resources. The English, stretched thin across their vast holdings, struggled to maintain control. Du Guesclin's raids chipped away at their defenses, while local lords, resentful of English taxes, began to waver in their loyalty. In 1369, Charles V formally renounced the Treaty of Bretagne, declaring war once more. The fragile peace shattered, and the war resumed with a new intensity. French forces, under Du Guesclin's command, retook key towns, Poitiers, La Rochelle, and others, piece by piece, like a tide slowly reclaiming a shore. Picture a French castle under siege, its walls battered by catapults as Du Guesclin's men encircle it. The English defenders, once confident, now face dwindling supplies and the constant threat of betrayal from within. Charles V, from his throne in Paris, supported these efforts with diplomacy, securing alliances with Castile and Scotland to pressure England on multiple fronts. His strategy was one of patience, a chess game played across years, not days. The English, accustomed to the swift victories of Crécy and Poitiers, found themselves outmaneuvered. The Black Prince, his health failing, grew frustrated, his temper flaring in acts like the sack of Limoges in 1370, where civilians suffered his wrath. Such brutality, meant to cow the French, only fueled their resolve. By the mid-1370s, England's fortunes were waning. Edward III, once the Lion of Crécy, was aging, his court plagued by factionalism. The Black Prince, weakened by illness, died in 1376, leaving England's hopes in the hands of his young son, Richard II. France, under Charles V and Du Guesclin, reclaimed much of the territory lost at Bretigny. The English held only a few coastal enclaves, Calais, Bordeaux, and Bayonne, a shadow of their former empire. Du Guesclin, though not invincible, became a folk hero, his name whispered in taverns and sung by troubadours. Yet, his death in 1380, while besieging a castle, cast a pall over France's resurgence. Charles V died soon after, leaving the throne to his young son, Charles VI, a boy unprepared for the burdens of war. The French resurgence was a testament to resilience, but it was not a complete triumph. England, though weakened, was not defeated, and the war's embers still glowed. In the quiet of a French countryside, where fields once burned now began to heal, the people looked to their new king with hope and fear. The victories of Du Guesclin had restored pride, but the cost was heavy and the future uncertain. Both nations, exhausted by decades of strife, faced a choice: to seek peace or to plunge deeper into conflict. As the 14th century drew to a close, the war seemed to pause, its rhythm slowing like a heartbeat. But could this fragile balance hold, or would new leaders and new battles reignite the flames? The answer lay in the years ahead, where the war would awaken with a fury that would test the very soul of both nations. As the 1370s faded, the 100 Years' War settled into a restless slumber, its fires dimmed but never extinguished. The fields of France, scarred by decades of battle, grew quiet, their silence broken only by the wind rustling through abandoned vineyards. England and France, both weary from loss, stood at a crossroads. The deaths of Edward III and his son, the Black Prince, had left England under the boy-king Richard II, a child of 10 whose crown sat heavy on his brow. In France, Charles VI, barely 12 when he ascended the throne in 1380, faced a kingdom teetering on the edge of chaos. The brilliance of Charles V and Bertrand du Guesclin had restored French pride, but their passing left a void, and the war, like a smoldering ember, needed only a spark to flare anew. Picture a twilight landscape, where castles loom over misty valleys, their watchfires flickering as both nations brace for the next chapter of their endless struggle. The late 14th century was a time of faltering dreams. England, once buoyant with the triumphs of Crécy and Poitiers, now grappled with internal strife. Richard II's court was a nest of rivalries, where ambitious uncles and nobles vied for power. The English treasury, drained by years of war, strained under the weight of maintaining garrisons in Calais and Bordeaux. Across the Channel, France faced its own turmoil. Charles VI, known as the Beloved in his youth, showed signs of the madness that would later define him, leaving his uncles, the Dukes of Burgundy and Berry, to govern in his stead. These regents, more concerned with their own power than the kingdom's welfare, squabbled as France's hard-won gains began to slip. The people, from peasants toiling in muddy fields to merchants in bustling towns, yearned for peace, yet the war's pull was relentless. The conflict reignited not with grand battles, but with a slow burn of raids and skirmishes. In the 1380s, both sides tested each other's resolve. The English, under Richard II's advisors, launched chevauchés, devastating raids meant to weaken French morale. Picture English horsemen galloping through the French countryside, their torches setting barns ablaze, leaving trails of smoke and sorrow. The French, in turn, struck at England's shores, their ships harrying coastal towns like Winchelsea and Rye. The sea, once a stage for England's triumph at Sluys, became a battleground again, with French and Castilian galleys challenging English control. In 1386, France planned a grand invasion, amassing a fleet at Sluys, but internal disputes and bad weather scattered their hopes like leaves in a storm. On land, the war stagnated, neither side able to land a decisive blow. The English clung to their strongholds, their longbowmen still a fearsome force, but their campaigns lacked the vigor of Edward III's era. France, meanwhile, rebuilt its armies, drawing on the lessons of Du Guesclin. New commanders, like Olivier de Clisson, adopted his guerrilla tactics, harassing English garrisons and avoiding open battles. Imagine a French forest at night, where shadows move silently, and English sentries fall to swift, unseen blades. These small victories bolstered French spirits, but Charles VI's erratic leadership sowed doubt. His bouts of madness, first evident in the 1390s, left France vulnerable, as rival factions, the Burgundians and Armagnacs, began to tear at the kingdom's seams. The people bore the war's weight most heavily. In England, peasants rose in the 1381 Peasants' Revolt. Fueled by taxes and discontent, their pitchforks raised against a crown that demanded much but offered little. In France, the burden of war taxes sparked unrest, with towns like Paris simmering with rebellion. Picture a marketplace in Rouen, its stalls half empty, where merchants whisper of lost trade and mothers pray for sons sent to war. The chivalric ideals of knighthood, once celebrated in songs, felt hollow to those who saw their homes burned and their fields trampled. Yet, amidst the hardship, stories of resilience emerged. A farmer rebuilding a charred barn, a widow weaving cloth to feed her children, their quiet defiance a testament to the human spirit. By the 1390s, both nations sought respite. Truces were signed, fragile as autumn leaves, and talks of peace filled the air. Richard II, seeking to secure his rule, married Isabella, Charles VI's daughter, in 1396, a union meant to bind the warring kingdoms. For a time, the fighting slowed and the Channel grew quiet, but peace was a mirage. England's nobles, restless under Richard's rule, deposed him in 1399, crowning Henry IV, a warrior with no love for truces. In France, Charles VI's madness deepened, and the rivalry between Burgundians and Armagnacs erupted into civil war, splitting the nation as rival dukes vied for control. The war's rhythm had changed, but its heart still beat, driven by ambition and old wounds. As the 14th century gave way to the 15th, the 100 Years' War seemed trapped in a weary stalemate. England's dreams of a French crown faded, while France, divided against itself, struggled to unite. Yet in the quiet of this uneasy pause, the seeds of a new chapter were taking root. Across the sea, a young English king, Henry V, watched with hungry eyes, his mind set on reviving his ancestors' glory. In France, a kingdom torn by factionalism awaited a spark to reignite its spirit. The war, like a river slowed by winter ice, was ready to break free, its currents pulling both nations toward a moment of destiny. What would it take to shatter this deadlock, and who would rise to claim the mantle of victory? The answer lay in a muddy field, where a new legend would be born. The dawn of the 15th century broke over a Europe weary of war, yet unable to escape its grasp. The 100 Years' War, now stretching across generations, had settled into a fitful stalemate, its battles reduced to skirmishes and its promises of peace as fleeting as morning mist. France, torn by civil war between the Burgundians and Armagnacs, was a kingdom divided, its mad king, Charles VI, a shadow of royal authority. Across the Channel, England found new fire in Henry V, a young king whose ambition burned brighter than any since Edward III. Picture the year 1415, with autumn rains soaking the fields of Normandy, where the clash of steel would soon ring out once more. The stage was set for a battle that would etch its name into legend. Agincourt, a triumph born of mud, blood, and the unrelenting will of a king. Henry V, at 28, was a warrior forged by discipline and faith. His lean frame and piercing gaze a stark contrast to the boy kings of the past. Crowned in 1413, he saw the French throne as his birthright, a claim rooted in Edward III's legacy. France's internal strife was his opportunity. The Burgundians, led by John the Fearless, and the Armagnacs, loyal to Charles VI's court, were too busy tearing at each other to unite against an invader. Henry, with an army of some 8,000 men, mostly longbowmen and dismounted knights, landed in Normandy in August 1415, intent on conquest. Picture the English fleet, its sails catching the wind as soldiers disembarked near Harfleur, their boots sinking into the damp earth. The siege of Harfleur was grueling, costing weeks and many lives to disease, but its fall gave Henry a foothold and a spark of hope. Weakened by dysentery and low on supplies, Henry's army marched toward Calais, seeking to return to England. The French, finally roused, mustered a force of perhaps 20,000 under the Constable Charles d'Albret and the Duke of Orleans. They shadowed the English, cutting off their path near the village of Agincourt on October 24, 1415. Imagine the scene. A narrow, muddy field flanked by dense woods, rain falling in sheets, turning the ground into a quagmire. The English, exhausted and outnumbered, camped in the chill of night, their campfires sputtering under the downpour. Henry, walking among his men, spoke words of courage, his voice steady, invoking God and country. Across the field, the French nobles, confident in their numbers, feasted and boasted, their armor gleaming in the torchlight, unaware of the storm awaiting them. Dawn broke on October 25, St. Crispin's Day, and the Battle of Agincourt began. The English formed a tight line, their longbowmen staking sharpened poles into the mud to break a cavalry charge. Henry, clad in a crowned helmet, stood at the center, his presence a beacon for his men. The French, slowed by the sodden ground, advanced in heavy armor, their knights packed tightly between the woods. The English longbows sang, their arrows slicing through the rain, piercing plate armor and felling horses. The French charge faltered, men and beasts slipping in the mud, their ranks crushed together, unable to maneuver. Wave after wave met the same fate, arrows raining down like a divine judgment. When the French finally reached the English line, Henry's men-at-arms met them with swords and axes, fighting with a ferocity born of desperation. The battle was a slaughter. The muddy field became a graveyard, with French nobles, dukes, counts, and knights piled among the fallen, perhaps 6,000 or more. English losses were astonishingly low, numbered in the hundreds. Henry, standing amidst the carnage, was both victor and witness to a miracle, his faith in his cause unshaken. Chroniclers would later write of his speech before the battle, immortalized by Shakespeare, urging his band of brothers to fight for glory. The reality was grimmer, yet no less heroic, a testament to the longbow's dominance and Henry's tactical genius. The French, shattered, retreated, their pride broken, their nobles decimated. Agincourt's triumph paved the way for the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. France, reeling from defeat and civil war, agreed to extraordinary terms. Henry V was named heir to Charles VI, marrying the king's daughter, Catherine, to seal the pact. Imagine the French court, its grandeur dimmed, as Burgundians and Armagnacs grudgingly bowed to this foreign king. Henry's dream of a dual monarchy seemed within reach, his banners flying over Paris. Yet victory was fragile. The Armagnacs, loyal to the Dauphin Charles, rejected the treaty, retreating to the Loire Valley to regroup. England's hold on France required constant vigilance, draining men and gold. In the villages of Normandy, peasants whispered of resistance, their eyes turning south to a prince who refused to yield. Henry V's glory was undeniable, but it came at a cost. The war's brutality deepened, and the seeds of future strife were sown. In England, songs of Agincourt filled taverns, but the treasury groaned under the weight of conquest. In France, the loss at Agincourt was a wound that refused to heal, yet it stirred a quiet resolve. As Henry planned his next campaign, unaware that his life would soon end, France waited for a savior. The fields of Agincourt, soaked in blood and rain, stood as a monument to ambition and sacrifice. But could England's triumph endure, Or would a new voice rise from the ashes of defeat to rally a broken nation? The answer lay in a small village, where a young girl heard whispers from the divine, her destiny intertwined with the war's next chapter. The year 1429 hung heavy over France, a land battered by a century of war and division. The triumph of Agincourt and the Treaty of Troyes had left the kingdom fractured, its crown claimed by an English king, Henry V, and his infant son, Henry VI. The Dauphin Charles, rightful heir to Charles VI, was a fugitive in his own land, his cause fading in the Loire Valley's shadowed courts. The Burgundians, allied with England, held Paris, while the Armagnacs clung to scraps of resistance. Picture the French countryside. Fields trampled, villages burned, and a people weary of endless strife. Yet, in this darkest hour, a light emerged from an unlikely place. A small village called Domremy, where a peasant girl named Joan heard voices from the heavens, calling her to a destiny that would change the course of the 100 Years' War. Joan of Arc, barely 17, was no warrior born of noble blood. Picture her standing in a meadow, her dark hair tucked beneath a simple kerchief, her eyes distant as she listened to the whispers of St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. These divine visions, vivid and unyielding, urged her to save France, to lift the siege of Orleans and crown the Dauphin as Charles VII. In a world ruled by men clad in armor, her conviction was a quiet fire, burning with a faith that defied doubt. In early 1429, she left her village, traveling through bandit-ridden lands to the court at Chinon. Imagine her there, a slight figure in rough wool, standing before skeptical nobles, her voice steady as she declared her mission: to deliver France from English chains. The Dauphin, a man of wavering resolve, was captivated by her certainty. After priests and theologians tested her, finding no heresy in her words, Charles granted her a chance. Joan, clad in armor tailored for a knight, rode to Orleans, a city under English siege since October 1428. Picture the scene: Orleans' walls battered, its people starving, their hope dwindling as English forces tightened their grip. Joan's arrival in April 1429 was like a spark in dry tinder. Mounted on a white horse, her banner bearing lilies and the name of Jesus, she rallied the French troops, her presence electrifying. Soldiers, hardened by years of defeat, found new courage in her unyielding faith. She moved among them, her voice calm yet commanding, urging them to fight not for glory but for God and France. The siege of Orleans turned on May 7-8, 1429. Joan, though no tactician, inspired the French to attack English fortifications with relentless zeal. Imagine the clash at the Tourelles, a key bastion. Cannon smoke curling through the air, French soldiers scaling walls as Joan stood fearless, her banner high. Wounded by an arrow, she refused to retreat, her resolve steadying the troops. By nightfall, the English were driven back, their siege broken. Orleans was free, and Joan, dubbed the Maid of Orleans, became a symbol of hope. News of the victory spread like wildfire, igniting French spirits from the Loire to the northern plains. In villages and towns, people whispered her name, their prayers mingling with dreams of a restored kingdom. Joan's mission did not end at Orleans. She urged Charles to march to Reims, deep in Burgundian territory, for his coronation. The journey was perilous, but town after town, Auxerre, Troyes, opened their gates to the Maid, awed by her divine aura. On July 17, 1429, Charles was crowned Charles VII in Reims Cathedral, Joan at his side, her banner trembling in her hands. Picture the cathedral's vaulted heights, sunlight streaming through stained glass as the crown settled on Charles's head. For a moment, France felt whole again, its people united by the vision of a peasant girl who defied the world's order. Yet Joan's heart was restless. She spoke of driving the English from France entirely, her eyes fixed on Paris. The campaign for Paris in September 1429 faltered. The city, held by Burgundians and English, resisted fiercely, and Joan was wounded again. Charles, cautious and indecisive, hesitated to press the attack, sowing tension between him and his fiery champion. By 1430, Joan's star, though still bright, began to wane. She continued to fight, leading skirmishes in the Loire Valley, but her divine voices grew urgent, warning of her capture. In May 1430, at Campigny, disaster struck. During a sortie against Burgundian forces, Joan was cut off, pulled from her horse, and taken prisoner. Imagine the moment. Her banner falling, her armor clanging as she was seized, her eyes still fierce with defiance. The French troops, stunned, retreated, their hope faltering without their maid. Joan's capture sent shockwaves through France. The Burgundians, eager for profit, sold her to the English for 10,000 gold crowns. She was taken to Rouen, an English stronghold, where she faced a trial orchestrated by pro-English clergy. Picture her in a stone cell, her hands bound, facing a tribunal of grim-faced bishops. Accused of heresy and witchcraft, she answered with clarity and courage, her faith unshaken. The trial, a mockery of justice, ended with her condemnation. On May 30, 1431, Joan, just 19, was burned at the stake in Rouen marketplace. Her final words, calling on Jesus, rose above the flames, and her ashes were cast into the Seine. France wept, but her spirit lingered, a beacon in the darkness. Joan's death was not the end but a spark. Her martyrdom galvanized the French, turning despair into defiance. Charles VII, stirred from his lethargy, began to rally his forces. The English, believing they had crushed the French spirit, would soon face a resurgent enemy. In the quiet of a French village, a mother might tell her children of the Maid, her story a lullaby of hope. The war, now entering its final decades, would turn on the legacy of a girl who heard heaven's call. But could France, inspired by Joan's sacrifice, finally cast off the English yoke, or would her death be a fleeting cry in a century of strife? The answer lay in the battles to come, where a kingdom's fate would be decided. The year 1431 cast a somber glow over France, its heart still aching from the loss of Joan of Arc. Her death at the stake in Rouen, a flicker of flame that consumed a peasant girl's life, had not extinguished the fire she kindled. The 100 Years' War, now stretching across a century, had woven a tapestry of blood, ambition, and resilience, and its final threads were yet to be spun. France, under the newly crowned Charles VII, stirred with a quiet determination, while England, clinging to its French territories, faced the weight of a war grown heavy with time. Picture a land weary of conflict. Fields once golden now scarred, villages rebuilding amidst the ruins, and a people dreaming of peace. The war's end was near, but its conclusion would come not with a single clash but a slow, grinding tide, shaped by Joan's legacy and the will of a nation reborn. Charles VII, once a hesitant dauphin, had been transformed by Joan's faith in him. Crowned at Reims, he was no longer the shadow king of a fractured realm, but a leader resolved to unify France. The Maid's martyrdom, though a wound to the French spirit, became a rallying cry. Imagine a Loire Valley town, its marketplace buzzing with whispers of Joan's sacrifice, her story passed from mothers to children like a sacred tale. Charles, bolstered by her legacy, began to reform his kingdom. He strengthened his army, creating a standing force of professional soldiers, and leaned on skilled commanders like Jean Bureau, whose mastery of artillery would prove decisive. The French, once humbled at Agincourt, now fought with a new vigor, their hearts lifted by the memory of a girl who defied empires. England, meanwhile, struggled to hold its gains. Henry VI, a boy king crowned in Paris in 1431, was a faint echo of his father. Henry V, his advisors, divided by factionalism, squabbled as England's treasury dwindled. The Burgundian alliance, once a cornerstone of English success, began to crumble. In 1435, the Treaty of Arras reconciled Charles VII with Philip the Good of Burgundy, a diplomatic triumph that isolated England. Picture a grand hall in Arras, where French and Burgundian nobles clasped hands, their faces wary but hopeful, as England's dream of a dual monarchy faded. Without Burgundy, the English grip on northern France, Paris, Normandy, and beyond, grew tenuous, their garrisons stretched thin across hostile lands. The war's final phase was a slow unraveling for England. French forces, emboldened by Charles's reforms, launched campaigns to reclaim lost territories. In 1449, they swept into Normandy, recapturing Rouen, where Joan had met her fate. The Battle of Formigny in 1450 was a turning point, where French artillery and cavalry overwhelmed an English army, their longbows no match for cannon fire. Imagine the scene. A misty Norman field, the roar of guns echoing as English archers, once invincible, fell under a hail of iron shot. By 1451, Normandy was lost, its castles flying French banners once more. In the south, Gascony, England's last major stronghold, came under siege. The Battle of Castellan in 1453 sealed its fate. Jean Bureau's cannons, a symbol of a new age of warfare, battered English defenses, and the French victory ended England's hopes in France. Only Calais remained, a lonely outpost on a foreign shore. Picture Castellan's aftermath, a battlefield strewn with broken lances, the air thick with gunpowder's acrid scent. The English commander, John Talbot, lay dead, his army shattered. Across France, church bells rang, not for war but for peace. The 100 Years' War, though never formally ended by treaty, was over. France, bloodied but whole, emerged as a unified kingdom, its identity forged in the crucible of conflict. Charles VII, now the victorious, ruled a nation that had found its strength, its people bound by a shared struggle and the memory of Joan. In England, defeat sowed discord, fueling the Wars of the Roses, a civil strife that turned brother against brother as the crown's authority crumbled. Joan of Arc's legacy endured, a beacon across time. In 1456, a posthumous trial cleared her of heresy, declaring her a martyr and a saint in the eyes of her people. Her story, woven into France's soul, inspired poets and painters, her name whispered in prayers and songs. The war itself reshaped the world. France emerged with a stronger monarchy, its feudal ties giving way to a centralized state. England, stripped of its continental ambitions, turned inward, its energies shaping an island nation that would one day build an empire across the seas. The longbow, once a terror, gave way to gunpowder, marking the dawn of modern warfare. The war's scars on fields, in hearts, lingered, but so did its lessons, of resilience, of sacrifice, and of the power of a single voice to change history. Imagine standing on a French hill at twilight, the year 1453, as the last echoes of war fade. The wind carries the scent of new harvests, and distant villages glow with candlelight. The 100 Years' War, a century of epic battles, had tested the spirit of two nations, leaving behind a legacy of courage and loss. Joan's vision, born in a humble village, had carried France to victory, her faith a flame that burned through despair. As the stars emerge, one might wonder, what does it mean to fight for a cause, to hold fast against impossible odds? The war's end was not just a closing of swords, but an opening of new paths, for France, for England, and for the world they shaped. The story of this century of strife lives on, a whisper in the night, urging us to remember the cost of dreams and the power of those who dare to chase them. As the sun sets over the fields of France, where once the clash of steel and the cries of battle rang, a profound stillness settles, like a sigh from a world exhausted yet enduring. The 100 Years' War, stretching from 1337 to 1453, was not merely a series of battles, but a saga that carved the destinies of England and France into the annals of history. Picture those final moments in 1453, after the Battle of Castellan, when the last English banners fell in Gascony, leaving only Calais as a fading echo of their ambitions. The war, spanning 116 years, was a tapestry woven with threads of ambition, sacrifice, and resilience. A story of kings and knights, of longbowmen and cannons, and above all, of a peasant girl whose faith turned the tide. As we draw this tale to a close, let us linger in its shadow, reflecting on its lessons and the enduring spirit that shaped a new world. Imagine standing on a hill overlooking the Loire Valley, the air cool with the promise of autumn. Below, villages rebuild, their thatched roofs rising from ashes, while church bells toll not for war but for peace. The 100 Years' War was a crucible, forging nations from the chaos of feudal loyalties. France, once fractured by civil strife and English conquest, emerged unified under Charles VII. Its monarchy strengthened, its people bound by a shared struggle. The fields of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, soaked in blood, became legends, their stories told by firesides to children who would never know the war's terror. England, stripped of its French dreams, turned inward, its energies sparking the Wars of the Roses but also laying the seeds for a maritime empire that would one day span the globe. The war's end was not a single moment but a slow dawning, a realization that the world had changed, its future shaped by gunpowder, governance, and the will of ordinary people. At the heart of this century-long struggle stands Joan of Arc, a figure both mortal and mythic. Picture her in Domremy, a girl of 17, her eyes alight with visions as she stood in a meadow, the wind whispering of her divine mission. Her courage lifting the siege of Orleans, crowning a king, facing death with unyielding faith, became France's heartbeat. Her trial and execution in 1431, a tragedy orchestrated by fear and politics, only amplified her voice. By 1456, when her name was cleared, she was no longer just a martyr but a symbol of hope, her story etched into France's soul. Imagine a mother in a French village, telling her daughter of the Maid, her words a lullaby of strength. One person, armed with belief, can change the course of history. Joan's legacy reminds us that even in the darkest times, a single spark can light a fire that endures. The war's legacy is not just in the borders it redrew or the kings it crowned. It marked the twilight of chivalry, as knights in shining armor fell to the longbow and cannon, heralding a new age of warfare. It reshaped societies, as the Black Death and War's demands loosened feudal bonds, giving rise to a world where peasants dared to demand more, and nations began to dream of unity. In France, the war birthed a sense of nationhood, a pride that would echo through centuries. In England, defeat forced a reckoning, turning its gaze from continental conquest to the seas. The war's scars on fields, in hearts, linger in the stories we tell, in the castles that still stand, their stones whispering of battles long past. Reflect for a moment on what this war teaches us. It is a tale of human endurance, of the cost of ambition, and of the power of resilience. From Edward III's bold claim to Joan's divine mission, from the muddy fields of Agincourt to the cannon-blasted walls of Castellan, the 100 Years' War is a mirror to our own struggles, our battles for identity, purpose, and survival. It asks us to consider, what are we willing to fight for, and what sacrifices are too great? As you drift into the quiet of this story's end, imagine the faces of those who lived it, the knight raising his sword, the peasant rebuilding his home, the girl who heard heaven's call. Their courage, their losses, are part of our own story, a reminder that history is not just the past but a living thread that binds us all. Now, dear listener, I invite you to carry this story forward. If the saga of the 100 Years' War has stirred your heart, if Joan's courage or the clash of armies has sparked your curiosity, let it live beyond this moment. Subscribe to this channel, where we weave more tales of history's triumphs and tragedies, each crafted to guide you into the past or lull you into sleep. Share this video with someone who loves a good story, who finds wonder in the echoes of long-ago battles. Leave a comment below. Tell me what moved you most, whether it's the longbow's deadly song or Joan's unyielding faith. Your thoughts are part of this journey, a spark that keeps these stories alive. And if you crave more, join our community on Patreon, where we dive deeper into history's hidden corners, offering exclusive content to fuel your imagination. Hit the bell icon to never miss a tale, and let these stories be your companion, whether you're seeking knowledge or a gentle path to dreams. The 100 Years' War is over, but its legacy endures, a whisper in the night urging us to remember, to learn, and to dream. So, as the stars rise over fields once torn by war, let us rest in their light, grateful for the stories that remind us who we are. Until next time, my name is Sherry, and thank you for joining me on this journey.